You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I'll be your host, Abraham.
And I'm your co-host, Ryan O.
And so today we were talking the power to will.
Ooh, willpower.
Yeah, that one. That's correct. And so there's important to distinguish right off the bat here what we're talking about in willpower, and is that different from self-control?
And so we looked a lot into this, and we both looked independently, and I couldn't really find anything.
Yeah, it seems like everybody seems to talk about willpower and self-control pretty much as the same thing, that they're not really fundamentally different. And so we're just going to talk about willpower and self-control as the same thing this episode.
So if that makes you mad, then you can hit us up in the comments, link us some things.
Yeah, I'd actually, if anybody has any good resources on this or they have a really strong opinion, we'd love to hear from you. So please send us an email or a tweet or whatever you want to do. You can comment on our SoundCloud, and we will be happy to make any corrections on a future episode.
It was hard to find. I'd be impressed.
Yeah.
And I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing to also talk about before we get into this in the definition, when we're talking about willpower and self-control, is this whole idea of the self. It seems pretty intuitive, like we seem to know what we mean when we say willpower or self-control, but the self is actually a more complicated concept than maybe what it sounds like.
Yeah, so it sounds really simple. You talk about myself, yourself, herself, himself, right? Like
all the pronoun selves.
All those selves. But yeah, there's a lot. I remember stumbling across in graduate school, like entire books and books of summarized, edited chapters just on that topic.
Yeah, what is the self? So all we're saying is we're not really going to tackle that right now. We're just talking about this concept of self-control and willpower and what that kind of means.
So what we mean by that when we say that is that we're regulating behavior in the presence of some sort of temptation or impulse.
Right. So just to wrap a few more words around that, in a similar way, it's when you are doing something to manage your own behavior when you really want to do something else, or when there's some other motivation to do something other than what you should maybe be doing in a particular circumstance. And so let's actually start with some non-examples of willpower. I think that it really helps highlight what we mean when we're talking about willpower, because it's not so simple as just these black and white scenarios of you chose to, like, I put the cookie down because I wasn't going to have a cookie right now. And so I'm going to ask you, Ryan, would it be willpower right now? We're sitting here in this chair in our studio recording. Are you deliberately withholding the temptation to fly into the atmosphere and shoot laser beams out of your eyes?
I definitely am not.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, so it's not just that you're not doing it, and so it's willpower to regulate that, right? All right, here's another one. We're sitting, there's a table in front of us. Are you controlling, you're having self-control, are you practicing willpower to not set the table on fire?
Again, I don't think so.
Okay. I'm going to get a little bit more down to earth.
All right.
Because we're out of the superhero and arson phase. Is it willpower that you avoid getting up and just walking out of the room?
Not necessarily right now, I would say, but...
So you kind of want to.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm into this. I like this podcast. But there's times in which I've sat like in a meeting and things like that, and you're like, man, I just want to like get up and get out of here. And maybe that is, willpower or self-control that I'm using in that situation. Yeah,
there are definitely going to be some times that I can think of that I've been in a situation where I was thinking, I want to just, what would happen if I just stood up and left right now? Especially when I'm at the DMV or the post office. But anyway, another one, and this is I think relevant to me, is I follow a relatively strict diet. I'm not going to go into, but I'm on a relatively strict diet, and for me, following that diet really doesn't take any willpower, because it's just what I do. And so I don't feel a temptation to deviate from this diet that I follow, because I've just been doing it for so long. It's just how I eat, And you have a similar story about that.
Yeah. I've known you for 9 years. You've had the same diet, right?
Yeah.
I have, for 8.5 years of that, probably tried to like improve on mine at various points.
That's good.
I actually, it was for 4 years, I was trying to like increase my fruit and vegetable consumption and kind of like eat an overall healthier diet. And it was a lot of things. We kind of talked about in the self-management one a little bit, so I'm going to refer people back to that if they want to know as to like what my kind of quick fix was. But when I specific to Willpower, what I remember is the first few months when I was really kind of getting into it and I was liking it, it was still very tempting. And there was a lot of things where it's just like, I need to chug 2 bottles of water before I go to this event so that I'm not hungry or I'm not tempted,
Sure.
right? And I do those sort of things that we're going to actually get into a little bit later, right?
Yeah.
And however, it's a lot easier now after 9 months or so. Like I'm not finding myself doing those things as much or at all in some circumstances.
So that's going to directly tie into something we get into in terms of sort of practicing and some of the research on how self-control develops and whatnot. So
yeah.
Now, there were essentially 3 different ways that we found that self-control is sort of talked about, and they sort of fall in this way. And there's also kind of a distinction between self-control and willpower. But the 3 ways that I sort of found that people talk about this or use it maybe is that you are either blocking temptation, so you're avoiding the temptation at all. You are choosing an alternative in the presence of the temptation, or you are choosing to push through something that requires a lot of effort and you're just sticking to it. So those are sort of 3 different ways, and maybe they're not fundamentally different, but they might be easy to give examples inside of those categories.
Sounds like the perfect clickbait title: 3 ways to gain self-control.
It does.
Like you just described the continuum.
I did.
Here's your 3 steps.
Boom. Don't know if I'm gonna go with that title. I'm afraid to use too many 3 ways, 5 ways, 10 ways.
Yeah, no,
titles.
I'm not saying. I'm just saying like I could see that article being written and like do really well.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, that would be somewhere on some blog site. So let's go with the first one I mentioned, the blocking temptation. So what's an example of this to you?
So blocking temptation, for me, it's just not putting yourself in that situation.
Sure.
So for me and my healthy eating sort of habits, Friday nights are a very likely time in which I want to go out. I want to have a drink and eat all of the awesome, amazing fried food in the world or burgers or whatnot. And it's very simple. I mean, it's not very simple, but the change was just don't go out to those sort of events.
Yeah, so it's just deliberately avoiding situations where you'd be tempted to do the wrong thing. And another example is maybe you drive by this donut shop and so you take an alternative route, so you don't even go buy it. You don't have the excuse of it's right there, I could just park and walk in, it would only take 5 minutes on my trip and I can get some donuts. So you just maybe find some alternative route to take, and then you don't even have to face the temptation of stopping and getting donuts.
Another one that I did in my life is when Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 came out.
Yeah.
I played that thing at least 14 hours a day outside
Video games
of
are a
work.
good example of this. Yeah.
And yeah, I lost an entire 5-week like winter break at UNR. And my roommate came in, he's like, "You ready for school tomorrow?" I was like, "No, that's not tomorrow." And it was. So I unplugged the PlayStation, I gave it to him, and I said, "Do not let me have this."
Wow.
Just completely avoided it.
That's a big one.
I've plugged it in twice since then. That was 7 years ago.
Jeez.
6 years ago. 6.
That's a really good example.
Yeah.
There have been, so at one point in my life, I may have liked checking emails or sending emails. I'm not entirely sure. It's not the case anymore. But I had in Gmail, they have this feature where if at a certain time of day, it will block you from sending an email and you have to complete some task.
Oh.
And so mine was after, I think it was 10 p.m. I had it said, maybe 11 p.m. If I tried to send an email, I had to solve a math problem first. And if I got it wrong, Gmail would tell me a drink of water and a nap for you, go back to bed. And it was really just prevent sending stupid late night emails where they didn't make a lot of sense. And a couple times it actually really stopped me from sending dumb emails that I didn't mean to send. So that was my way of blocking the temptation, is making it so I had some obstacle get in my way so that I couldn't do it.
Yeah. All right. So that was the first one. Let's go to the second one.
Okay. So the second one I mentioned was choosing alternatives in the presence of temptation. And so this one's very different in the sense that you don't avoid temptation at all, but you allow yourself to end up in situations where you would be tempted to choose the thing that you want to do. Mm-hmm. So you don't avoid going to the donut shop. You go drive by the donut shop and you look at it and you're like, not gonna do it.
It's a very hard thing to do, even after lots of experience.
It is very difficult. And I think that if you are someone who has a diet or you're trying to follow a diet, hanging out with friends who want to go out and drink and just be merry and eat fried foods and whatnot, it would be difficult to go hang out with those people and then not partake in those activities, especially if you're used to doing that.
Yes, I very much have cut out in the last 9 months when I was making that progress, just completely cut out seeing some people in some situations. And it's been a little difficult because you got to like rebuild those other ways. But there's some people I don't see as much as anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I just realized another one I was going to say, and this comes back to the example you gave about Call of Duty, was when you choose to do your homework, even while your friends are there playing video games, and maybe a video game that you like, and you instead make that choice of, even in the presence of, I really want to play video games, I'm going to sit down and do my homework. Mm-hmm. And so that would be another example of this willpower / self-control sort of thing that people do.
Yeah.
All right, and the last one I'm actually going to wait a little bit to get to because I want to dig into the research a little bit, and then we can talk about the self-control as it relates to sort of effort and physical exertion. I think that's sort of its own little subset of things. So let's actually dig into the research a little bit. So there's a few good examples of this that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this marshmallow test. We're going to talk about, there was a study that someone did, I don't remember the authors now, who looked at different ways to practice self-control and whether or not that actually strengthened your sort of resolve or willpower in those moments.
Yeah.
And then some other things that have happened from people practicing self-control, as well as one area we're going to dig into a little bit more at the end called delayed discounting. Or what's the other? It has some other names. I don't remember what it is. Maybe delayed gratification is the other name I've heard used for it.
Yeah.
So let's call it delayed gratification. Okay, so on that, what would you predict, based on what you know and your experience in your field, what would you predict would be a way that you could strengthen your self-control or willpower?
How do I strengthen it?
Yeah.
I mean, I've done it historically through the three things that we talked about.
Okay.
So I actually first, and this took, each one's different, but I personally look at what are the triggers and the cues, and and how can I work on avoiding the ones that are very tempting, but then slowly introduce them back so that I can like practice the alternatives in the presence of those cues and triggers. So
one thing that I thought of is one way to practice self-control or building your willpower, getting better at these sort of things, would be to actually practice it specifically. Put yourself in a situation where you have to practice it, or do those strategies that we talked about. And so someone specifically looked at this in this study where they had people with these tasks, and they had them specifically practice self-control in one situation, and then they put them in another situation. And what they found for the majority of these people, which I thought was really interesting, is that if they practiced self-control in the immediate first situation, in the next situation, they would actually then give in. And so it was sort of like they were justifying giving in to the second one by practicing it in the first place.
Yeah.
So they were thinking, or whatever they were thinking, was something along the lines of, it's okay if I do this now because I was good on step one.
Yeah.
And an example of this is just to go in sort of pop culture referencing, in the movie Click, Adam Sandler's character he's walking through the kitchen, and there's a package of Twinkies and the package of, I think they're called yellow. I don't know what they're called. I'm just gonna call them fudge pies. Anyway, so he comes up with the first one, and he's looking at the Twinkies, and he says, "I don't need it. I don't need it. I don't need it." And then he walks past it, and he gets to these fudge pies. And he says, "I do need a fudge pie though," and picks it up and goes. And there's an example of this. Practicing self-control in the one instance, then the immediate instance afterwards is sort of like, well, I was good, so I can do it now. So that was one thing that they found in here. Or I guess the summary of that was that the practicing of self-control leads to a decrease in self-control for something in the future. But there are others that have found actually something very different. And so let's talk about this marshmallow test.
Yeah, so the marshmallow test is like the infamous, there's a marshmallow book. Yeah. It's been all over the place, right? Yeah. It was Stanford, I think, where it came from, right?
Yeah, in the 1960s.
Yeah. So it was real simple setup. You could have one marshmallow now.
And this was with kids, specifically. Yeah, young kids between 4 and 6 years old.
You could have one marshmallow now, or you could have two marshmallows later being 15 minutes away.
Okay.
What did we see?
So what they found was, and they replicated this several times, I think that they've done over 600 kids now, what they found was that most kids would wait the 15 minutes. But there were some that would eat it right away, as you might imagine. But most kids actually did wait the entire time. And what they were also looking at, for those who were willing to delay that gratification, how did they do later on in life? And what did they find there?
They generally had better life outcomes. And those were like super broad, right? Like they measured things like BMI. Yeah, they looked at their BMI. It's very funny. They looked at their BMI. They looked at their SAT scores, their general educational, skill or improvement later on in life. Yeah.
And so all of that's well and good, and I think it's worth asking the question, why did they wait? For those many kids who waited, why did they wait? And one important thing to look at first is acknowledging what was the situation these kids were in. And we'll notice right away that these kids were given a rule by an authority figure that said, don't do this.
Yeah.
Or at least, wait for this, and then you'll have a better reward.
As a young child, especially some Stanford researcher in a clinical white jacket, right?
Yeah.
Like, how often do you get those, and like, would you break that rule?
Right. And I don't know if they tried replicating this with their parents or with other authority figures or anything like that. And this also reminds me of the Milgram experiment, the obedience to authority thing. But this whole notion of you can't factor out the rules that were implicit there. If you had just left them with a marshmallow and said nothing, then that probably would have had a very different outcome. And obviously they wouldn't know that they were delaying gratification. So maybe, whatever is going on there, I think it's really worth considering what were the rules and what was their history with rules and following rules. Maybe for those kids who didn't wait, they had learned early on in life that they could just not follow rules, get the reward that they wanted, and it's all well and good for them.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 marshmallows isn't really worth it to wait 15 minutes, and 1's good enough.
Yeah. And that's always going to be a problem, right? Like measuring the history of a person. Like,
yeah.
You can't measure it all. You try to capture what you can. That's why in studies we have general age ranges that are selected.
Yeah.
And things like that, right? So as hard as we knock it, like it is hard to measure, I would say.
It is totally difficult to measure.
Extremely hard.
And the other thing is...
But you can still try.
Yeah, you absolutely could try. And you could also see if there were other things that sort of affected, if you could teach kids to wait, or you could try other rules. You could maybe try shortening the period of time that they have to wait. Maybe it's only 5 minutes, that sort of thing. And there was also something really interesting that they noticed. They're, of course, watching these kids as they're waiting. And so this actually goes back to one of the things we mentioned, is a lot of kids would choose some distraction away from the marshmallows. So there was almost nothing else in the room. But certain kids would turn away and not look at the marshmallow.
Put their head on the table.
Yeah, they'd put their head down,
so
they'd cover their eyes. There were, if girls or anybody in there had long hair, they would play with their long hair. Apparently, some of the kids would stroke the marshmallow like it was like a pet or something. And so that goes back to this. They were sort of employing the strategy of blocking temptation in a way, and also some of them were instead choosing to do something else in the alternative. And so, yeah, there was just, it's worth considering what were these other things that these kids had learned, how did that affect what the choices that they made in this situation, and what else could we learn about the situation by, I think one of the important takeaways is just to say that we can't just say that these kids just had better self-control, that they were born with this willpower, or that was in any way related to whatever their genetic makeup was in that situation. At least that was the most important variable, because we haven't accounted for all these other variables that are important.
For sure, I totally agree.
So that being said, what might the brain have to do with it? Well, like we've mentioned in many other episodes, it kind of has everything to do with it, and that's part of the story, not the whole story. The brain regions involved in this, well, there's many, especially because you are probably going to be hearing or looking at or other ways sensing the thing that you're interacting with, whatever situation you're in. You have to know that you're in that situation in order to make the choice to avoid that temptation.
Yeah.
But specifically, the research has found that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DIPFC, not that either one of those is
For
easier to
remember.
remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the frontal lobes, this all has to do with the frontal lobe part of the brain. Those are specific or primarily or more active or critically involved in these processes where you are, quote unquote, exercising willpower or self-control. Yeah. And that inhibition of the premotor cortex is also involved in this. So, but I guess the overall take home here is that most agree that this is a very complicated, very interconnected process. It's influenced by, like everything else, these genetic biological preparedness of the individual. So how are they biologically set up to do in this situation? And then what are the circumstances that are likely to facilitate or to prevent the development of good self-control or willpower? So all of those things are wrapped together. Do you have the circumstances, and are you biologically set up to take advantage of the circumstances?
Kind of sounds like our view on a lot of things.
I think, unfortunately, it will probably largely come down to, we're going to say a lot of this, that those are you are going to have the biological preparedness, or the genetic and biological preparedness to take advantage of certain circumstances, and the circumstances have to be present in order for that biology to really matter. Now, the third one I was going to talk about in terms of how is this a little bit different, and this might be one of the only places where we found that there maybe is a difference between around how people talk about self-control versus willpower, is with physical endurance type activities, and a lot with like sports.
Yeah.
And so you might not, at least my history with this, or my interaction with people talking about sports in this way, tends to be more with willpower than it is self-control. And I'm thinking of someone who's trying to maybe lift something really heavy. If they succeed, then I'm more likely to say, wow, they've got really good willpower, or really strong willpower, than, wow, they've got really good self-control.
Yeah.
And so the third one that I was going to mention, apart from the other two, was this being able to endure, or I guess push through these difficult, high effort sort of situations.
Yeah. So Michael Jordan playing basketball, being
Yeah.
sick with the flu, scoring whatever it was, 50 points or something crazy like that.
Right.
Like those sort of things where everyone's like, oh, he's got so much willpower.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. So in that case, they probably wouldn't say he's got so much self-control, but more. But there isn't otherwise anything really fundamentally different. But if we look at this, in the case of Michael Jordan having the flu or whatever he was sick with, what is the temptation there that he was managing his behavior and was not giving in to the temptation?
It's hard to identify, right? I mean, in that specific example, the idea was like, oh, he's sick. He's got all these other variables affecting him. Like, how is he still performing so well?
Yes. And if we were to going back to this definition of when you're managing your behavior in the presence of temptation, what's the temptation there?
So the temptation's just to give up.
Yeah.
Be done with it.
Right, yeah, and that's, I think, a lot of these where you are pushing through, maybe you're lifting a really heavy weight, and the temptation is to give in, is to put it down, to give up, to stop trying. And so when you push through that, and it's, these physical situations, that's this willpower thing. So again, it's not fundamentally different. It's still regulating your behavior in the presence of some sort of temptation. It's just in this case, the temptation is to give up with something that's really physically difficult to do.
Yeah.
Now, again, acknowledging the role of the brain here, this is going to require somewhat different regions, just because your brain's going to be having to coordinate a lot more muscles than it was if, for example, you're just choosing don't drive past the donut shop or something like that. And it's also going to have to coordinate just the different contexts. You have a lot more visual stimulation that you're having to deal with. You're having to do a lot of sort of calculating what kind of moves are happening and where you need to be and that sort of thing. So that's all going to involve different brain regions. But the overall function of these situations where you're dealing with physical exertion isn't really fundamentally different from the other ones. But it's worth pointing out that this seems to be where the term willpower is used different from self-control. And mostly that they seem to be sort of the same. So I guess another contextual example of the use of self-control or willpower here is similar to, I mentioned, running weights, playing when you're sick. And another one, and we've talked about this on the podcast multiple times, is when you're running. Running, in my experience, is difficult, and it's mostly unpleasant. So how about in the situation where you're running and you're essentially running as fast as possible, even though you're completely out of energy, you continue to push yourself and run? Is that an example of like willpower or self-control?
I would totally label it as willpower, self-control.
Yeah, and I would too. And I think in the situation, you go back to the same idea that the temptation is just stop, give up. Why are you running? But I'm going to throw a wrench in this.
Okay.
So let's say you are being chased by a bear.
Yeah.
Is it now called self-control or willpower that you continue to run as quickly as possible?
I don't know. It's probably saving one's life, running for one's life.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not necessarily self-control. You might say that you still had to dig for that willpower.
Sure.
For that external thing of a bear chasing you.
Yeah.
That is a hell of a different scenario, right?
It is.
Well, yeah. It's there's clearly an external factor there. Whereas when you were just talking about running itself, there wasn't really a clear external factor there, right?
Yeah. There is one more difficult to identify.
Yeah.
And probably more subtle. And so you kind of in the situation of weighing your pros and cons. Is it worse to be eaten by a bear or worse to be really tired from running? Probably worse to be eaten by a bear. Maybe someone is thinking, I'm definitely just done running. I don't care if I get eaten by a bear. Running's the worst. Okay, so there was, in a lot of the research I was doing for this, I found this book that seemed like it is very related to, or people might be interested in checking out. I didn't actually read through the book, but I got some snippets from it. The book was called Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength, and it's written by Roy F. Baumeister and John Tierney. And this one highlights a lot of the examples of what we've talked about so far in terms of self-control and what is it. And there was you found this cool article about the science of self-control and willpower and that sort of thing. And so what did you find in this one?
All right, so this was an article that came from Psychological Science, recent-ish, last couple of years, and simply they had two different groups. One group of people were given the option of, hey, you could receive this reward now, it was a monetary amount, or you could wait 1 month and you could receive this other monetary amount that was more.
Okay, so they could have one or the other one.
Yes.
Okay.
Now the second group, it was phrased a little bit differently. So what they said is you can have this monetary amount now, and you can have this other one that's more if you just wait another month.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so just to give the example, when they both had the same choices, the only thing that they changed was the word or the word and. And so if it was, for example, you can have $1 now or you can have $20 in a month, they might say you can have $1 now and you can have $0 in a month, or you can have $0 now and you can have $20 at the end of the month.
Yeah,
Is that about
exactly.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
and it wasn't just the words or and. The idea was like, are these things perceived to be connected or disconnected?
Right. And
so it
this
was
is
the connected that they were really focusing on. And the interesting part was that the members of the second group, where it was connected, they used that and like we did in our examples, they found that they were more likely to wait for the better deal at the end.
So if they perceive them more as a sequence of events that were taking place where they were related to each other and not as a choice between you get one thing or you get the other thing, instead as a choice of you get both, sort of, where one is equal to 0 and one is equal to the amount.
Yeah, so part of the title that was like summarizing this on the website that I found it on, it was actually newyorkmag.com, was at a subtitle that said, rely on your imagination more than your willpower.
Okay.
So the idea, and I get it, their imagination is saying just like looking into the future and these things kind of connected, right?
Yeah.
So we actually talk about that when we look at a behavioral science kind of view of this sort of thing, right?
Sure.
All right, so another interesting thing that they found was they were looking at brain scans of the two groups as well. And those presented with the simple like this or that, so they're using that or, right? Showed more activity in the areas associated with willpower. What those are, I do not know myself. I'm not claiming to be an expert in those sort of things.
The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that has, the DIPFC is what it was summarized as.
Yeah, I was listening to you talk about it. I just do not know that world very well.
That's okay.
Well, those that were given the sequence that were like linked showed more activities in the areas of imagination.
Oh, I see.
So that's where they kind of came up with the title and kind of talked about all this sort of stuff.
I got you. So they were more sort of hypothesizing their choices when they were linked with the and more treating it as I have to make a conscious decision to either wait or have what I want right now, and that was more associated with the willpower, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
And that was what and that was what the brain scans that they did.
Yes.
And that actually relates to a topic we're going to talk about in another episode about neurobabble.
Coming up soon.
Yes.
Cool. So where does that take us?
So this is actually very much in line with some of the behavioral economics research that's been done on a topic called delayed gratification or delayed discounting. And what that means is that the value of a reward discounts or decreases over time. That's the whole idea of delayed discounting, is that the longer that you have to wait for a particular reward or money or whatever it is you want in time, the less valuable that works. And so do you want $20 now or $20 a year from now? Well, you're going to say now, because in a year from now, what are you going to do with that? And then what they do is they ask these questions where they just adjust those values and say, okay, do you want $20 now or $100 a year from now? You might go with $100. And then they're just going to keep scaling it down until that point where you'll select the smaller sooner reward, what they call it, smaller sooner, or the larger later reward about the same frequency, and that's called an indifference point. And so the whole idea of this behavior economics is this shows that people, about the place at which people will choose their rewards as they are delayed in time. And the overall premise of this is that the delay to that reward is the most important variable in understanding how people choose the things that they choose, right?
Yeah, so it sounds really simple and useful, right? We talk about that historically on this podcast. We talked about things that are very simple and work for us, right, would be kind of our best things to rely on or use.
Yeah, totally. And they actually, so not only do this with money, but they do the similar experiment with things like shock. Do you want a large shock now or a small shock later? People and rats, they've done it with different organisms and pigeons and whatnot. If you are discounting the value, will choose the small shock. This is a way that people study things like addiction is very common, financial planning is very common, dieting. This is really wrapped up in a whole lot of the stuff that we've talked about in other episodes on self-management and self-control and habit reversal, like all of that sort of wrapped up in some of this.
Yeah, so and like to kind of tie in what I was talking, or like the reason I brought it up is we are interested in these like very simple solutions to things, but if you're missing a key component, then you've kind of committed a bigger error there, right?
Well, and it might not work as well. And so one thing that's important to look at in the delayed discounting or delayed gratification research, this behavior economics stuff, is that it has some things that I've personally really wondered about whether or not it's really valuable or that this research is, I guess, hitting all the critical features that are relevant. Because one thing is, and this goes back to when we were talking about those kids, is how does our language factor into this? What, for those of us who tell ourselves, I can't wait that long, or I don't know if this is really going to be of value to me in a year from now, or whatever it is that you say, what got you to the point where you are more likely to choose the smaller sooner or the larger later? What are your current circumstances? Is someone who's really, really broken and desperate straits more likely to choose the smaller sooner reward because they just need something and they're confident in the year they just won't be in that position again?
Yeah.
And so all of those are factors that are going to be related to how people make those choices that aren't accounted for just by that delay. And presumably if you can talk to someone and give them other strategies for waiting for the larger reward, then they already have some of those strategies going into a test like this. You just don't know what they are.
Yeah.
But those might be really, really important in understanding how people make that choice. And so I guess looking at and trying to get some good science around understanding why people are more likely to choose a delay or choose the larger reward and delay their gratification to that is not just as simple as how long do we delay it. That's part of it, and that's an important variable, but that doesn't account for things like language. And another one that's always been curious to me in these studies is their main variable that they're looking at is value. And in dollar amounts, it's at least relatively easy because you can say, $20 is more than $1. But what's interesting about that is the subjective value to a person.
Yep, yeah. So a $100 bill to Bill Gates versus a $100 bill to you and I on the side of the street.
Yeah.
Extremely different.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So, I might fight for $1. And someone else who has a lot of money might say, I don't need $1. I'm not going to work for that.
Bill Gates, if you ever hear this, it was just an example. Sorry, man.
Yeah. Mr. Gates, if you're listening, please send us an email. We'd love to have you on. Anyway, so that although you can calculate that dollar amount, that subjective amount is going to be very different. And again, maybe you're someone who just got a really big bonus from work and got asked that question is not going to have the same effect as someone who just lost their job and is now extremely concerned about feeding their family. Again, this comes down to maybe in a few months I'm going to have a different job. I'm not going to be worried about this, but right now I absolutely need any and all income that I have. Yeah. So it's part of the circumstances.
So to kind of wrap up this delayed discounting, it's pretty descriptive of what's going on, but we're questioning how much it really predicts, right?
Yeah, like what someone's going to choose, in the future. If all you're looking at is the delay, we don't really know what they're going to do. You might have an idea, and you can certainly say that in general, when you delay access to things, people are more likely to pick the sooner option. But that's about as specific as you can get with anybody, and you don't necessarily know what any one person is going to do because everyone's a little bit different. Now, going into this whole language thing, I think this is just important in understanding and willpower, and I'm going to make this a little more concise than I had planned to originally. And I just want to talk about this, the fact that when we're talking about language, and we're going to get into this in a lot more detail in a later episode, but language is, in a sense, thinking of symbols as if they were the things that they represent. So if I were to tell you, for example, your mom just died, then you might have the same physical and mental reaction to that as if you actually experienced your mom dying.
Yeah.
And that is because my words can represent the event itself. And the reason that this is important to this whole idea of willpower is because sometimes we can have these situations where our words represent the temptation, and the temptation's not really a thing. It's more about our words that are getting in the way of whatever it is we're trying to do. And our words and our language, and this, I mean, I say words, but I also mean sort of our thinking about it, our logic and our reasoning and our rationale for how we do things, that justification piece of I was good now, so I can give in this time.
Yeah.
That all is related to this idea of how our words can get in the way of these. And for an example of this I thought of is how people might treat a phobia, for example, where I might say, I'm not going to go outside because I'm really, really afraid of people. I'm really afraid of diseases. I'm really afraid of getting attacked and things like that. And diseases and people and attacked are all things that could exist in the world, but they don't necessarily live right outside the door. That's just the words that I might have around that. And that's not to disparage anybody who has agoraphobia or suffers from these debilitating phobias where they have trouble being around these situations. Just that a lot of times these are rooted more in language than they are the actual circumstances. And there are people who are in really serious circumstances where they can't leave, and those are real threats. And I just want to highlight what that role is. But one way you can potentially address this, where the willpower to go outside, is to address the language around what exists or the thoughts that people have around their hesitation to do these things, because you can just say, hey, that's just what you're saying about it. That's not reality.
So can you build your willpower in those situations?
Well, let's go back to the definition of willpower. If willpower is regulating your behavior in the presence of obstacles or temptation, then yes. There might be other physical or skill limitations that can get in the way, going back to this idea of sports. And it might actually, and this is, I think, a really important key point here, is it might actually be dangerous to try and build someone's willpower to try something that they're not physically ready or don't have the skills to do well. So I might be really hesitant to fly an airplane because I'm not a trained pilot. And if you try and build my willpower to believe in myself that I can definitely fly an airplane, that doesn't mean I'm going to sit in the cockpit in an airplane and safely take off and land. I'm probably going to kill everyone on board, including myself. Not on purpose, because I don't have the skills ready to do that. And so in certain cases, it might be more about building the physical skills that are needed, for thinking of things like lifting weights. If I go in and say, I'm going to build someone's willpower so they can lift this 100-pound weight, well, they could actually really hurt themselves. Yeah. But if they actually build up their muscles to the point where they can lift that weight, then they're more like, then it's more important to have that willpower. And the other one is going back to this idea of skills, like with flying a plane, is you build that foundational skill to do that thing, then you might actually get willpower kind of comes along for the ride. Now that I know how to do it, I'm more likely to try and be able to succeed because I have the foundation necessary to do it right.
Cool. I dig it.
I think, you got anything else to cover on this one?
No, I think that's a pretty good summary.
Sweet.
Yeah.
So let's just overall take home here. What are we walking away from with this?
So willpower and self-control are used pretty darn similarly.
Yeah.
Throughout everything we could find.
True.
And if anyone has anything that shows otherwise, we'd love to hear from it.
Yeah.
That's
the
first thing. What was our definition again? That willpower that we kind of locked into? Yeah,
I think it was just that it's a description of how you regulate your behavior or how you perform in the context of temptation or obstacles, and you want to take the more difficult route than the easier route.
Yeah, so we do it all the time, all sorts of different activities, right? Like you can span theoretically it could span anything that we do.
Yeah, correct? I sit down. I think people who get good at this and they go to a restaurant, they're really, really hungry, don't just order everything that looks good on the menu. Some people probably do. I know I'm more likely to order 3 things if I'm really hungry. But most people sit down, they'll order the one thing. Even if they're really hungry, they'll order the one thing, knowing that when they have eaten that thing, they're not going to be so hungry. They aren't going to want all those other things that they've ordered. And people do that all the time. I might want to text or call someone, but I'm at work, and I know this is an inappropriate time to do that, so I'm not going to do that. So there's some willpower there. And so there's a lot of situations where you just have to use willpower on these sort of mundane, everyday sort of humdrum things.
Yeah, so that said, there's a lot of different things that affect it. That was another thing that we hit on really, really hard. One of the big ones that isn't talked about as much is this rule kind of following in the language we use.
Yeah, absolutely. The language could really play a huge part in our willpower, and especially in the things that are getting in the way of us making choices about things that are important to us. And so those, how we think about it and how we talk about it and how we talk to ourselves about it and how we talk to other people about it all can relate to our willpower. And I think the last one, also on that point, is that you can improve your willpower through practice, through those strategies that we talked about.
Yeah, developing your physical abilities.
Yeah, building the foundational skills that you need, and then putting yourself in a situation where you have to practice it and actually following through on that, not just justifying it. And but with the caveat in there that it's important that you have those skills so that you aren't just practicing willpower and then putting yourself in a situation where you're likely to get hurt or hurt someone else because you focused on the willpower and not the skills or the physical strength that you needed.
Yeah, so like I said before a few different times on these episodes, is it's always an individual kind of like database approach, right? Like where are you at, where are your skills, and where you're trying to get to, and start mapping those out and taking small steps.
Boom.
Cool.
I think we got it.
With that, I'm Ryan O.
This is Abraham.
And we are out.
Signing off.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. Why We Do What We Do is supported in part by ABAI's Disseminating Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group and our amazing listeners. If you like what you heard, consider heading to our Patreon account at patreon.com/WWDWWD podcast. Anything helps, and we are continuously lining up perks and merch for our supporters. If you have any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Find us at WWDWWD podcast on your favorite social media platforms. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. There, you'll find links as well as detailed and shareable show notes. Why We Do What We Do is Abraham, Ryan O, and Miranda. Artwork and logo design by Andrew Pollock at nogdesigns.com. Video and production assistance from Tyler Bessire with music courtesy of Justin Greenhouse. Brendan Bohr does our episode art. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.